Hello and welcome to our More Than a Story webinar. Tonight we're doing a research showcase and we've got four fabulous researchers presenting their work for you. My name is Dr. Liz Evans and I'm an Associate Lecturer in English and Writing at the University of Tasmania, where I teach family history within the English department. I'm joining you this evening from my study in southern Tasmania, and I acknowledge with deep respect the traditional owners of this unceded sovereign land, the Malukadi people. I pay my respects to their elders past and present. I acknowledge First Nations peoples throughout Lutruwita, Tasmania and Australia, and I recognise and honour their spiritual connection to country, community and culture, not least the sharing of story across time and generations. I stand for a future that values and foregrounds their perspectives, culture, language, and history, and I support the continued efforts to strive for Aboriginal justice and rights that will ensure a stronger future for us all. As we're meeting online across Australia, I invite those of you in Australia to acknowledge and pay your respects to the traditional custodians of the lands on which you live, study, and work. So before I and my co-host, Dr. Tahisha McCabe, welcome our speakers, I'll just run you through a few housekeeping requirements. Our session, including the chat, will be recorded this evening and uploaded to the YouTube channel along with all our other webinars. If you have a question for any of the speakers, please use the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen, as questions in the chat won't be answered. We'll have some time at the end for our speakers to respond. This evening, we're extremely fortunate to be joined by speakers not only from Australia, but also the University of Strathclyde in Scotland, where it's now, I think, about 9 a.m. in the morning. In a moment, my co-host, Dr. Tahisha McCabe, will introduce our Strathclyde scholars. But first of all, I would like to welcome two PhD candidates from the University of Tasmania. Jane Giblin is a Tasmanian artist with a 39-year exhibition history, whose work is represented by Hobart and Melbourne galleries. Jane's PhD research explores her matriarchal and patriarchal ancestry through both family history research and a studio practice underpinned by drawing. Jane aims to offer new ways of approaching family histories by situating her work within regional communities and encouraging audience speculation. Elizabeth Walsh is also a history PhD candidate who is based in South Australia. Over the last 30 years, she has studied externally at several Australian universities and completed her Master's in Education, specialising in leadership and management in 2017. Her interest in the women of the Flinders Ranges in South Australia began when a high school student asked her why there were no women in a picture of the local pioneers, which I think is a great question. And I'm so glad that our young people are asking these kinds of things. So over to you, Tahisha.
All right. Well, good evening, folks. Sorry, I froze there for a moment. Good evening, good morning, actually, to those. I can see a few folks in the participant list who I know are either in Europe or in the UK. So good morning to you all, and good evening to the rest of you. My name is Tahisha McCabe, and I am in Glasgow in Scotland, where, yes, you're quite right, it's just after 9 in the morning. Thanks. I am head of the Strathclyde Institute for Genealogical Studies, which is a new program that the university has kicked off. And as part of that, we encompass our master's degree, which looks at genealogical, paleographic, and heraldic studies. It's an online degree, and we have folks from all over the world on the degree, including, as alumni, our two speakers this morning or evening, Ian Mooney and Nikki Wurlitzer, who both graduated quite recently from the master's degree and are now obviously going on and doing our joint PhD that we run with history, and it's history with genealogical studies, and it's just the, well, I think from what we can understand, it's the first sort of named PhD that has genealogy in the title. So we're quite chuffed about that. Ian and Nikki will be talking about their research, so I don't want to belabor that too much, but they are both based in England, while yes, our university is based up in Scotland, so it's a good example of kind of our cross-border arrangements. So without further ado, I'll just pass over to our first speaker, who I believe is Beth.
All right. Okay. Before I start, I wish to acknowledge the Wurundjeri people of the Yorke Peninsula on whose land I am tonight and pay respects to their elders past, present and emerging. I wish also to acknowledge with deep respect the Adnyamathanha people who maintain a deep physical, cultural and spiritual connection to the land known today as the Flinders Ranges. Tonight, I'd like to share with you some of my PhD research on the 19th century women of the Northern Flinders Ranges and why I believe family history is an important pathway to understanding the place of women in rural and remote Australia. In Australia, it's not uncommon for the only history of a place to be written by local or amateur historians. These histories are often written at a time of settler anniversaries, and in South Australia, the 1980s was one such period. It may be a product of the time of their writing or a feature of the genre, but these local histories predominantly showcase the exploits of European men, be it the fearless explorer, the battling farmer, or the benevolent clergyman. This white male-centered view of the past is widespread. Women, First Nations people, and people from other backgrounds are scarcely mentioned. Rather than critique the work of local historians, it's important to see these omissions as an artifact of the racist and patriarchal nature of colonial settlement and the legacy of historical record keeping which privileged the position of men. By focusing on families, it's possible to build new versions of the past. Researching families provides not only the opportunity to move the focus from power and politics to hearth and kin, but it also allows us to reshape the narrative of rural and remote Australia. My family history, like that of many other South Australians, my ancestors arrived in the first 20 years of the colony and most settled in the copper mining areas of the Yorke Peninsula and Kapunda. In my family tree, there are no convicts. I'm a South Australian, a couple of Anzacs and some family scandals. My family history journey was a good introduction to the research from a PhD project. There is no extended family with the answers or family diaries or letters left behind to tell their stories. Like many women in my research, our story comes from the pages of Trove and searchable vital records and a few old photographs. None of the women in my family would have made it into a local history book. It's highly likely that my version of my family's history has been and continues to be coloured by my feminist sensibilities that were aroused in response to this image. One of my Adnyamathanha students asked the question, where are the women? Maybe it's because she's strong in the knowledge of her own family story that she did not need to ask, where are the Yuras, the Adnyamathanha people? She knew the answer to that question. In an Udnu or European version of history, it was obvious there'd be no Yuras. But what she couldn't understand was why in this version of history there were no women. So that was the start of my quest. But I was a teacher, not a historian. What did I know about writing history? An honours degree in Australian Studies gave me the basics, but not the tools. So I turned to my family historian's toolkit and began to research the women of the Northern Flinders Ranges, one family at a time. But my work has become so much more. It's become an investigation of the role of women in rural settler households and communities. It's raised topics such as the tropes of the pioneer woman and as women as civilising influence in the bush. It's provoked questions about how and why women were rendered invisible in rural economies and how this continues to have implications for contemporary rural women. I've had to consider the ethics of appropriating other people's family stories and the impact that the darker side of family history has on contemporary family relationships. I've questioned my own biases and prejudices and struggled with the implications of writing settler history and whether in doing so, I'm further silencing the voices of First Nations people. What started off as a quest to put women back into the history of the Northern Flinders Ranges has become much deeper, broader investigation of the history of women in rural settler communities and the challenge of building that history from fragmentary evidence. In the final few minutes, I would like to share some of the story of the hidden women of Hollowalina. First, I'd like to acknowledge the work of Frances Fran. Frances is the 5th generation of the Warwicks to run Hollowalina, and she's passionate about her station's history. Their support has been invaluable. In 1839, Jeanette and William Warwick and their children Mary, John and William migrated from Canobi, Dumfries, to the newly established colony of South Australia. After many years of managing properties for the Doctors Brown at Williamstown and Kanowi, the Warwicks moved north and took up the lease of Hollowalina in 1853. Hollowalina was one of the original pastoral leases in the Northern Flinders Ranges. From 1856, the station life, including the financial transactions of the station store, have been recorded in a series of journals. It is in these records that we find the first clues of the women of Hollowalina. One of the historical assumptions about these early sheep runs is that they were initially staffed by men, with women arriving sometime later. This appears not to be the case at Hollowalina. In 1853, Jeanette, William and their 10 children and a couple of shepherds travelled north to Hollowalina. Initially, Jeanette and the younger children stayed at nearby Arkaba station until suitable accommodation could be built. 2 more children were later born at Hollowalina. Early sheep runs were essentially small communities. The Warwicks employed labourers, teamsters, shepherds and shearers. Others employed on the station included managers, storekeepers, tutors, domestic servants and hut keepers. There was even a doctor at Hollowalina, although he was not directly employed by the Warwicks. It is through the store records that we get fleeting glimpses of the many women at Hollowalina. Women's attire, homewares and haberdashery regularly appear in the records being purchased by men. There is also evidence of an informal women's economy. Women were paid for needlework, washing and supporting other families. These transactions were recorded in the journal and settled through their husbands' accounts. On November 1st, 1856, the store records show Henry Gager purchased 2 yards of ribbon. It was this entry that first alerted us to the fact that he was not alone. In trying to discover who was with Henry, my first port of call was the shipping records. They showed that Charlotte and daughter Harriet arrived with Henry on the Caroline in 1855. Their son Henry had died during the voyage. 2 other Hollowalina women, Charlotte Bashir and Elizabeth Dearman, and their families also arrived on the Caroline. Next, a search of ancestry uncovered Henry and Charlotte's marriage certificates, records of their baptism, and Henry's 1851 census records. It is thought that Harriet was around 6 years old when she arrived at Hollowalina. She was of a similar age to the Warwick's daughters, Jane and Kate. In 1856, Warwick set up the first schoolroom at Hollowalina. John Cameron was the tutor, and Jane and Kate, along with their brothers, were his students. Henry Gager bought pencils, copybooks and slates in March 1857, so it is possible that Harriet was also having lessons. The next record I found was the baptism of Gager's son John in 1857. Although it suggests that he was baptised at Burra, some 250 kilometres away, it's possible he was baptised by the travelling priest who periodically held services at Hollowalina. This still needs some investigation. Mrs. Gager, Charlotte, appears in the Hollowalina store records in 1857, being paid for her needlework and paying other women. However, we lose track of her around 1862. Henry is no longer buying women's boots through the store, and other searchers have failed to find any trace of her. At 18, Harriet had her own listing in the store journal. She's earning wages as a house servant and later as a hut keeper, and we can see her spending money on boots, fabric, cottons, as well as paying for goods ordered from Adelaide. Harriet drew her last wages in May 1870 and on the 1st of June was married to George Butler at his residence near Blinman. George previously may have been a shearer at Hollowalina. Harriet went on to have 9 children and died in Blinman in 1892. Left with several small children, George later married Edith Henry nearby Alpana Station, but that's another story. Family historians amongst you will be very familiar with the tools I use to gather my evidence. What's different is the way that I'm using the evidence. Alongside telling the stories of women and families, I'm also building a place-based prosopography. Data about women is entered into a geographic information system, which records the events of their lives and places them on the map of the Northern Flinders Ranges. Once the data entry is complete, I will be able to visually and statistically analyse the evidence and answer some of the challenging questions about the characteristics and lives of women who lived in the remote part of South Australia. The Hollowalina story demonstrates how the research strategies of family historian can add to the history of rural settler women. Harriet Gauger and other women of Hollowalina may not be rich or powerful or have done extraordinary things, but their stories and their family stories are an important part of uncovering the hidden history of rural women in South Australia. Thank you.
Good evening, everybody, and good morning, everybody. My name's Ian Mooney. I'm currently doing a PhD at the University of Strathclyde. I'm going to talk to you a little bit about some of the research I'm doing, which is sort of following on from what Elizabeth was saying. It's sort of the unseen people. I moved up to Lancashire, Liverpool area about 4 years ago and became very interested in this sort of the poor of the late 19th century in Liverpool. Did some work on an industrial school, and interestingly, my master's dissertation was on women who were transported to Van Diemen's Land. So there was a direct link with Tasmania there as well. So today I'm just talking about a group of children called the Home Children, which is a sort of little known migration movement, which took place over it actually took place over 100 years and didn't finish until the 1960s, but is very little known in history. Imogen, can you flick forward for me, please? And again, please. So 80,000 children were sent to Canada between 1867 and 1917 from the British Isles. And these were poor children, children who were orphans. Some of them were street children, but a complete mixture of children who had very little or nothing in Great Britain, and were sent out on the premise of this will give them a good start in life. But in fact, what the research is starting to show is that it did not do that, and was actually a very useful sort of slave labor for farmers in Canada. I'm really specifically looking at the Liverpool Sheltering Home for Destitute Children. Imogen, if you can flick it forward again, please. And this was run by a lady called Louisa Burt, who sent about 6,000 children to Canada. And again, please, Imogen. That's an advert for the home from, well, it was in 1912, this advert went out. The idea that was put forward to the public, in this case in Liverpool area, was that it would rid Liverpool of the poor, which was seen as something bad. They weren't seen as people, they were seen as a problem in the city and in other cities across the United Kingdom. But it was also seen as, we're doing a great thing to help these boys and girls. What's interesting, and I'll show you a few bits and pieces as we go through, is none of the publicity, none of the history of this ever really looks at it from the children's point of view. Imogen, if you can flick forward one, please. That is the home today. And there is a lovely little irony on this home. So you can see there, that's the main building. The building to the right of the screen, or that part of the building, was the original home, and it grew, and benefactors gave them money to acquire this second bit of it. And that children's home still stands today. But the irony is that it's now student halls of residence for the 3 different universities in Liverpool. And I got to look round it only a couple of weeks ago, actually, that somebody showed me around. And it's quite luxurious accommodation nowadays, with quite large ensuite rooms with cooking areas and all sorts of things. But interestingly, they showed me in a little cupboard, a little electrical cupboard on the top floor, and somebody has put pictures of children from the 19th century on the wall in there, with little comments about these children were forcibly migrated to Canada and various things. Interesting little thing there that probably most of the residents haven't even seen or know is there. Imogen, if we can go forward. Now, the sort of impetus for this research was these 2 plaques on the front of this building. So I often walk past this building, and these 2 plaques caught my eyes. This is 72 boys and 1 lady who were in the home in the late 19th century, early 20th century, were sent out to Canada as part of the Home Children movement, and then lost their lives in the First World War fighting for the Canadian forces. And I just thought it's quite interesting that these people are sort of a footnote in history. They're not noted anywhere, really. They just happen to be victims of the First World War. But their history is important as far as I'm concerned. And so I wanted to start looking at what is it about these people? Why were these children in this home in the first place? What happened to them? Where did they go in Canada? And how did they end up signing up and fighting in the First World War? Now, they on their own, they would probably give a pretty similar story, because it's 72 boys who fought in a war and a lady who fought in a war. And so I wanted to get a wider perspective on this. So I've looked at the shipping manifests for the children who went out to Canada with them. So it's a variety of different ships. We're probably looking at about 4,000 people in total. If you can flick forward, please, Imogen, and just keep going down this one. So these are my various questions. And it's really about, it's using genealogical techniques to really look at who were these children. They are they're not nameless because we've got their names on that wall. But other than that, they're not really mentioned in history. And they're not mentioned in anything that's been written about home children. Interestingly, home children was a taboo subject, really, until about the 1980s. The children themselves saw it as a stigma, and people didn't talk about it in Canada until a journalist wrote a book about it. And then suddenly it became a more frontline topic that people started researching. But most of the research looks at it from the doer's point of view, the people who, like Louisa Burt, who took children out, not from the children and their families' point of view. If we can flick forward, please, Imogen, and again, that's it, and one more bit, I think, yeah. The popular opinion in the 19th century was that these children were dangerous, that they were a problem, and they were something to be got rid of. And that's actually Dr. Bernardo's view there. I won't read it out, you can see what it says, but it's pretty unsavory. That is Bernardo's view in 1879. And then if we flick to the next screen, please, Imogen, and again, Louisa Burt sort of says the same things, but actually possibly in a slightly kinder way. She talks, this is actually a piece she wrote about when they first opened the home in Liverpool. and the children that they were taking in. In fact, she took 300 children in the first year, but she had 600 applicants, but could only take 300 of them. If we flick forward again, please. So what sort of records are we looking at? So the home has its own committee minutes and yearbooks. BMD records obviously are important in this, parish records. Ship manifests are the core to this research, really, because that's the one place where we can definitely pull all the children together. There are letters from some of the children, and there are children's case files. And if we flick forward again, where are they? Well, University of Liverpool has some, Liverpool Archives has some, the Canadian National Archives have some. Knowlton is a tiny little town in Quebec province, which is where they had a distributing home. And so the children were sent there and then passed out to various farmers from there. And there are some archives there. There are people with personal collections. I've done a few talks on this, and interestingly, each time somebody has come forward afterwards and said, one of my ancestors was a home child, and here is what I know about them. And the final one has been my big problem in this first year of doing the PhD. Bernardo's took over the home in Liverpool in the 1920s, and so they are the guardians of the records of the home. And they wouldn't let me have any access. And interestingly, a colleague who works in child protection, child care at the University of Strathclyde finally opened the door for me. And next Tuesday, I'm actually down with Bernardo's looking at some of the case records. So they've finally granted me permission to see. And I think those, because I've seen one or two from people's personal collections, those records will unlock the family history. They're the ones that will start to show us who the relations are, what the family groupings are, and so on. And if we flick forward, and again, I won't spend too long on this, but that's just one little group of children that were sent out on one ship. And you can see there orphans. There were a lot of orphans, 23 orphans. Some of them only had one parent. Some were illegitimate. 18 had parents living. So that sort of fits into Louisa Burt's view of they were deemed not to be fit parents, or they neglected their children in some way. And various other things in there, other reasons why children were in that home and sent out to Canada. And if we can flick forward again. There are little things like this is in one of the yearbooks, and there is a little bit of spin in this. So this is sort of showing what children were like when they came into the home. But you can see the comment at the bottom, never knew a father, mother, one of the worst in Liverpool. So there's quite emotive language put forward. Next page, yes, please. That's a letter from one of the girls who's out in Canada. She sort of is very pleased she's out there. She says that at the very bottom, I would not go back to England of anything. I think that Canada is the best of all. But partway through this, she talks about her sister who was beaten, and could they help her find where her sister was now. So families were split when they got to Canada quite often. And if we flick forward again, that is, you won't be able to see it very well, but what's really useful on most of the ship manifests is it has this big bracket that says Mrs. Burt's party. And so it links all the children together. So we can get this disparate group pulled together, and we know when they left Liverpool, when they arrived in Halifax or Quebec, and when they got to Knowlton, which is where they were then farmed out to different people. If we flick forward again, just another letter and a picture of a boy, George Fisher. He talks about he wasn't paid the money he should be paid. And if we flick forward again, and one, yeah, that's it. That is one of the ships, and I'll finish on the next couple of slides. But this one, the Numidian, which left in 1897 in February, arrived in Halifax 1897 March. There were 65 children on this, And interestingly, they range from age 5 up to 17, even though this program was supposed to be for 14-year-olds and 14-year-old plus. But within this group, what we start to find is a whole group of families. And if we flick forward to the next slide, the Abrahams family, you won't be able to see that, it's a bit too small, but I've sort of started with the grandfather there. And if we go on to the next slide, these 3 children were sent out on the Numidian. So there were about 9 children, but 3 of them were sent out in 1897. And if we flick forward, the reason that I'm looking at this group is this man here, Percival Abrahams, who is on the plaque on the wall of the home. So he was a soldier in the First World War. And if we flick forward, and he was born in 1890. His father died in 1894 in December, and there were twin brothers born in May 1895. So you can see the family probably were in desperate situation. They left in 1897, the 3 children that went out here. He lived with a family called the Martins in a place called Winslow. He enlisted in 1916 and died in 1918. And if we flick forward again, I won't spend too much time on that, but that is a lovely little thing talking about his bravery in a battle and when he was actually killed. And if we flick forward again, that was sent to me by one of his descendants, and they actually have a military medal from the Canadian Forces that was awarded to him for his bravery. And then I think if we just flick forward, Bessie went with him, and then one more, Amy, also went with him to Canada. And she lived a long life in Canada, got married and stayed there the rest of her life. I'll just finish by saying that one of the interesting things about this family that's come up is an older sister who wasn't sent to Canada, emigrated to Canada after the First World War, and went out to the same area where her sisters were. 2 other brothers who stayed in the UK were killed in the First World War. And those twins that were born just after the father's death both died in infancy. So one of the things I'm trying to do really is look at whole families and work out what happened to families, both those who went out and those who stayed at home. And I'll finish there. Thank you very much.
Okay, can we hear me? I'm assuming we can. And I'm just adjusting my screen because I'm working from home, and you're going to see some of my notes in my presentation. So in this map, you can see that my project deals with the Furneaux Islands and an area called Giblin on the east coast of Tasmania. And the projects, I'm presenting to you projects that actually started in 2016, then flow into my PhD and flow also into a side project. So the Furneaux Islands, the Tiarichan Aboriginal people were very, very supportive of my original project in 2016. And now I am pursuing a new project in the land of the Paradirema. So my project has 2 contexts. One is the matriarchal lineage of my father, underpinned by an experience of poverty and lack of education and subsistence within the Furneaux Islands. And they developed through decades of hard work a love of that particular landscape and its waterways. The second project surrounds my father's more educated and patriarchal ancestry, and theirs enjoyed the employment of people such as those of the Furneaux and a relationship to landscape and place that one could really easily describe as recreational. They had the time to adventure through it as first-generation non-Indigenous Tasmanians, and the latter is the stuff of my present actual candidature. This is an image of Dog Island, and it is central to my father's matriarchy. I'm an artist who works with paper and ink and pigment. I make my own paint, and my artworks are normally very large. 3 meters wide and 1.5 meters tall. During project research and development, I really enjoy unfolding family and community through interviews and portraiture in context. At top right is a Tasmanian doctor of geography and a superb poet, Pete Hay, who is being driven around by my cousin Bradley. That is me on the top left, and I am drawing my great-grandfather's shed, which is built to house people who are mutton birding, short-tailed shearwater, on that island. My great-grandfather, Valentine Willis, was a street kid from Hobart who was adopted by wealthy English immigrants, and he ended up lobbing on Dog Island when he married my great-grandmother. So below that are samples of the work resulting from that research and interviews with family members. And there's an ink drawing, large work on paper, life size, of a young man who was lost in the First World War, and a lithograph of Bradley, who's actually sneaking the last of the mutton bird hearts that have been cooked up as part of the meal. Also resulting from that project is this drawing of my son and my book, 40 South Publishing. The reason I show this image of my son is because he's actually obtained his own mutton birding license. And the book contains the transcripts of 58 family and community interviews, and Pete's project-specific poetry, and my reflective commentary, and the entire 91 artworks that I produced. My present PhD project is entitled Drawing for Speculation, using a contemporary drawing practice to research and archive. This archive is a great big fat scrapbook of over 200 drawings by Catherine Penworn Ball, but I call her Kate. So she is here in this image in 1877. She's dead at 31, 11 months later. And at right is an extremely rare self-portrait. It's only 9 centimetres tall. 2 of Catherine's younger siblings married into my Giblin family. Before her demise, her 200 drawings were actually part of a collaboration with her little sister, Sarah. And Sarah then spent the next 70 years compiling them into the Sarah Mitchell scrapbook. I call her Kate, the drawer, because she signed all her work with KM. After her marriage, she made no more works in ink. Wendy Wurlitzer, who is an academic from your UK, reported to me in an email that 18th and 19th century women certainly recorded themselves in their journals and scrapbooks, but very rarely did they gaze at their audience. I'm fascinated by this woman exploring her actual place in Tasmania. These are some of the research projects, present context, which include archival theories and constellatory experiences of the points of view of the archive. Hal Foster, Sarah Callahan, and Grutenberg. I'm not going to go through the rest of those. You can see them there. There's a pile of artists who are really important to my project down the bottom, because this is drawing that I mean, I'm an artist, I am not a historian, but because I involve communities and their stories. So the intermingling of interviews with people and my artwork is really, really important to me. In Kate's 1875, 20 centimetre wide ink drawing, Minnie Giblin, my ancestor, is beneath her brolly here. In 2020, in the Royal Society of Tasmania collection, I explored the Sarah Mitchell scrapbook of her sister's work and found many of them depict my family. Through studio-based practical research, this project considers what a visual art practice might learn from that archive. The project uses the phrase "the archive" to refer to Sarah's scrapbook in addition to the writing and the drawings. So the whole thing is built into this scrapbook and the story. So historical records reveal no research focusing on Kate's work and very little evidence of everyday documentary drawing by 19th century Australian artists, particularly women, using pen and ink as their primary mediums. So Kate's documentation and Sarah's stories of their adventures and community all include the 2 key women. So they're there saying, we are here and we are looking out at you. They're like snapshots in an unfamiliar landscape. Australian history is full of artists recording colonial life, but rarely do they include the actual artist, and none so prolifically by women. This is the actual scrapbook, open, and on the right you can see Kate's bouquet from her wedding. And on the left are the many, many multi-stitched areas of the centre of the actual scrapbook. I'm asking now, how can an experimental and fluid drawing practice encourage speculation about relationships with place in Tasmania? And how can my liquid residue-based drawing practice invite empathy with these colonial women? These were first-generation women exploring a landscape that was cleared in a war that finished in 1831. So by the 1850s, 60s and 70s, these were first-generation people getting into this landscape without any British heritage sitting in that landscape. So female artists recorded their interiors, their portraits and landscapes, as well as the flora and fauna, but in pencil or watercolour and very rarely in ink. The project subject is additionally unusual in my case because the scrapbook, the drawings and the handwriting depicts and describes my ancestors. This is itself quite rare. I note here that the landscape is a force within this drawing. The 16-year-old Kate made this drawing and her marks respond to that landscape and to the wind and the rocks. In the middle of the drawing, you can see a tiny figure squiggled beneath it, and that is Sarah, the compiler of the archive, when she was only 10 years old. My premise is that Kate was quite capable of producing a detailed drawing and a landscape in watercolour, which was the usual paradigmatic practice for colonial women of the time. But I decided that because she could do this, that I was more interested in the marks that she made like that. And so I made this. This is a studio research work responding to her wild landscape work, seen through my figure and my action as the artist today. This is an amazing drawing by Kate. On the lower right, you can see the actual artwork, and this is the detail I've extracted, where Minnie Giblin, Kate and Sarah are here, and she has drawn them just as they are about to fall from the cart. As she ages, the landscape loses its place and it becomes a stage setting. So she's more focused as she ages because she's heading into her mid to late 20s, where it's a social setting, a community gathering, and the activity and the participants become much more central to her approach over time, and her drawings refine. In response to this actual body of artwork, I started in 2019-20, before my PhD started, actually copying Kate's work and producing small watercolours about the original material. These are approximately 25 centimetres square and are included with 57 others in a local gallery on show at present, which will tour Tasmania and Victoria. In these, I respond by simply extracting those details from the archive and adding colour. Common to colonial artwork of the time was the reproduction of the images of Australia in lithography in Australia, but also back in London, and typically by Louisa Ann Meredith, who made a great deal of money in such enterprise. But I decided that I was going to make lithographs out of Kate's details. So I tipped my hat by producing lithographs, and there's 19 of those in total. Back to the research now, I held reenactments in the actual landscapes that Kate worked in and Sarah's backyard. And I took descendants of the actual Mitchell family and my own family, and I photographed them with film and medium format cameras. And I sought to insert them into my own archive. I also sought to find out how she might have drawn. So this is me working in that landscape there and trying to prove that she was not actually drawing en plein air. She was drawing afterwards in the evening through conversation with her sister. In Kate's drawings, there are no pre-drawings, no pencil marks. She has approached the paper directly in ink. So these are my direct approaches in ink while sitting out in the field. Currently, I am pulling together images from the archive. There's Minnie Giblin again, from my own en plein air landscape works, and from photographs I have taken with an ordinary digital camera out in the field in her landscape. I combine those whilst I'm trying to grapple with my own understanding as a non-Indigenous woman in the Tasmanian landscape. And so in combination and as an underdrawing, there is this work, which I finished in 2023. It's 1.5 high and 300 centimetres wide. And that work is now in this condition. That's its finished condition. And my overlay drawing is a representation of my actual struggle to draw the multiple layers of the archive that I construct, and Sarah's archive, and my experiences in this Tasmanian landscape. I want to show you again the scrapbook, to take you back to that scrapbook, which belongs to the Royal Society of Tasmania. And I take you to the new scrapbook. I commissioned these two ladies, Diane and Penny, to build the scrapbook again, and twice as fat, because I am sticking copies of the entire archive back into this new scrapbook, but I am touring it around Tasmania and Victoria. And when I go there, to these places, I am workshopping with locals, getting their stories, getting them to write, getting them to draw using ink and nib, and donating work, if they wish, to this travelling scrapbook, which is now like a net that captures the new stories and new families related to the Tasmanian place, and also, of course, Victoria. We're going to Victoria, to the place where Mr. Ball, who married Kate, actually comes from, and I found that they have a gallery, so I'm showing the work there. So my PhD leverages off one layer of the story, and it's a speculative search for colonial relationship to place. And it's reported to you here from its broader context, where I re-engage with stories by documentation and contemporary translation in drawing, lithography and photography. And the stories are my stories, and they're entangled on this tiny island. And my studio-based research is trying to navigate with liquid tracing and reflexive methodologies through some of that entanglement. Okay.
So hopefully my microphone is working here. I finished my dissertation, my master's at Strathclyde last summer. My dissertation topic at the time was civilian enemy aliens in World War I Britain. So that was basically the Germans living in England during the war. That originally was the starting point for my choosing a PhD topic. But when I was researching that and checking the source data, I stumbled across the topic I eventually selected. And so my area of research for my PhD is the European migrants who were living in Sussex between 1851 and 1911. And one very obvious question, I suppose, is why Sussex? Where is Sussex, I suppose, should be the first question. If you look at the map on the right, Sussex is a county in the south of England, directly south of London. The reason I selected Sussex was it's my home county. I've lived in parts of it all of my life. I didn't plan, as I said, to use Sussex as a basis for research. And to be quite honest, at the start of the process, I didn't believe there were any foreign nationals living in Sussex at the time. To give you a bit of background on the county, during the 19th century, it was a rural county, more sheep than people, as I say in the title. There was some coastal development, but there were no major urban areas. There was no industry like there was in the north of England. There were some ports, but they weren't like Liverpool or Bristol. They were quite small, localised ports. One thing it did have, though, was a very substantial tourism industry, partly due to links with the royal family and British society at the time. And I was looking at existing research data on foreign nationals. There'd been work done mapping the number of foreign nationals in various registration districts as a percentage of the population. And much to my surprise, it showed that when it came to groups such as the French, the Germans, Italians and Russians, they formed a larger percentage of the population in 19th century Sussex than they did anywhere else in the country outside of London. and that included the major cities, the industrial areas. And so my question became, why? You know, why did these people come to Sussex? Why did they stay here? And who were they? And what were they doing here? So to touch on again, why Europeans? On a personal level, both my parents are European, but on a practical level, I also needed to put boundaries in place. And one thing that was interesting in the context of this session, after the Europeans, the largest groups of people with a birthplace outside the UK in Sussex were the Australians, Canadians, Indians, South Africans. These were predominantly British subjects born abroad rather than foreign nationals, and that would have given me an entirely different area of research. The first thing I did, there is anonymised census data available online, and I selected the period 1851 to 1911 to cover that. And I mapped what that told me about where in Europe these foreign nationals had come from. As you can see, predominantly they came across the entire period from France and Germany, but equally there were smaller groups from Italy, Switzerland, Belgium and Holland. One question I'm avoiding at the moment, I do need to address is, who is a foreign national? What do I mean by European? Towards the end of the period I'm studying, the British government introduced very stringent legislation on what defined someone's nationality. And what that said was, for anyone married to a foreign-born man or the child of a foreign-born man would adopt his nationality. So if Johann Schmidt from Germany came to Sussex, settled there, married a British woman and had British children, after the 1905 legislation dictated that these people born in Britain, you know, British all their lives, would become German. And that again, trying to define who was European, what was their identity, what was their nationality, and what was their nationality perceived as being, is an area I want to look at. I mean, I'm only 6 months into my research, but one of my first questions has been, as I said earlier, why Sussex? In terms of records, up until 1905, Britain had an open door approach to legislation, which means there were very, very few records on arrivals available. So I'm dependent on other records. I've mentioned census data, the usual genealogical records, but also organisational records from the group set up to support people travelling to Britain. Also French and German, Swiss and Italian organisations set up to support their nationals in this country. Tied into the question of why did people come to Sussex is how did they get here? There's very little evidence, with one exception, that people came here directly in the early days. The exception is the French. We're very close in Sussex to France, just across the Channel. And in the late 1840s and 1870s, there was a lot of political upheaval in France, and there's evidence of people trying to escape who would come directly to the French coast and then travel to the southern counties of England and to Sussex, where a lot of them chose to remain. At the moment, it's difficult to identify in the early days much other direct travel to Sussex. My question is, and the area I'm researching is, were their journeys originally to London? It makes sense as a nearby large city before they came to Sussex. But later on, as the groups and the communities established, I'm trying to identify, and it's beginning to look like families and communities and occupational groups in the county would call back to countries and to regions and to towns to bring workers over to join them predominantly in the coastal towns where they worked. And really it's in the coastal area of the county where I've identified a couple of pull factors, for want of a better word. occupational reasons why migrants came to Sussex. The first is the tourism industry. I didn't realise, but in early 19th century Sussex, Brighton in particular, became a very fashionable tourist resort. Prince Regent, who became George IV, moved to Brighton and built the Royal Pavilion here. And for those of you who haven't seen that, it's like a small version of the Taj Mahal dumped into the middle of Brighton. Due to his living here, a lot of the nobility, the aristocracy, quite wealthy individuals moved to the coast, or they holidayed in the coast. Many had houses here, and European servants, and they moved between London and Brighton. Interestingly, apparently Brighton also had the largest number of schools per capita in the country at the time. And it's interesting the number of young women in particular who were working as teachers and governesses who came to the county to work. And these were predominantly French or German. I just wanted to touch on a couple of initial discoveries I've made. It's been quite interesting looking at occupational profiles, and although these developed over time, in the 19th century, many European nationals fell into quite consistent occupational groups, and these are repeated looking at Sussex. I mean, waiters were German, all without exception. For all the hotels you look at in Brighton and Hastings along the coast, I would say in excess of 95% of the waiters were German. And the question then is, what part of Germany were people who were working here calling back home for family members, neighbours to come over and join them? Italians were interesting. Their occupations were quite regional. Those from the north of Italy, southern Switzerland, were restaurateurs, confectioners, ice cream salesmen. Other regions of Italy, Naples, they were very strongly musicians. Again, as I mentioned, it's been interesting, the sheer volume of young women travelling to the area to work. And you're looking at women in their late teens, early 20s, who in the middle of the 19th century were travelling across Europe, you know, across the sea to a foreign country, and then from London, a major city, down to the coast to work, and identifying how they made those journeys and why Sussex is an interesting question, and one I'm trying to source records for. Interestingly as well, there was an influx of European religious orders to the area in the late 19th century. I think there were something like 300 French convents across England at the time, and a substantial number of these were in Sussex, and understanding how and when and why these developed, it's been quite interesting. The picture on the right is actually of a pastry shop, one of many owned by an Italian family in various seaside resorts along the coast. And that's where I've got to currently. As I said, 6 months into what is a 6-year process, it's at the stage of being a lot more questions than answers.
Wow. Well, for incredible talks. Thank you all so much. Jane, Ian, Beth, and Nikki, all of you have just been investigating such amazing, interesting topics, and in such diverse fields as well. We've actually run out of time. We've gone over time. So we do have some questions for you, but I don't think we've got time for you to answer them, unfortunately. It's really just time for me to say thank you again so much. Our next webinar will be on the 18th of October. And our topic for that evening will be mixed race families. So that should be a really fascinating webinar, and we'll be sending out a link. So hopefully you'll be able to join us. But yes, again, thank you so much. And good morning to everybody in the Northern Hemisphere, and good evening to everybody down here. Take care, and we'll see you at the next one. Thank you so much.